Renaissance Nation is a thrilling account of Ireland's vertiginous rise and a timely exploration of its conflicted present, where stark decisions await the next generation of would-be revolutionaries. We have with us David McWilliams in conversation with James Crabtree.
Hello. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, can I see a hand? Very excellent. Hands up who's been to Ireland? Oh, okay. You're on home turf.
It's a home game, exactly.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Crabtree. I'm going to be your chairman for the next 40 minutes. It's my great pleasure to introduce David McWilliams, author of Renaissance Nation, a tour through a very optimistic story about the rebirth of Ireland, and one that, as we will discover, has some interesting resonances for those of you who live here in India or used to, as I did. However, before we do that, and before I throw a few questions at our lunchtime entertainment, we have to officially launch David's book here in India. So I'm going to ask David to do the grand unveiling. And wait a minute. And when he does that, I want you to give a really huge round of applause. So it's the first time he's launched a book in India. Wait. We've got to do the ritual. Okay, go on. Here we go. Wait for it. Wait. 1, 2, 3. There we go. Hey! Very good. Thank you so much. All right. So, thinking that we were going to do this book launch in front of a predominantly Indian audience, David had the genius idea in the opening chapter of comparing Ireland's renaissance over the last 10 or 20 years, and he quoted V.S. Naipaul's A Million Mutinies Now, making a direct allusion between the reawakening of India that Naipaul saw in the 1970s and afterwards, and Ireland today. And so the book broadly tells the story between two papal visits. The first in 1979, when Pope John Paul II visited Ireland, and then more recently in 2018. And so David charts, as I say, a remarkably optimistic story in which Ireland moved from being a poor, clerically dominated country where lots of people left as soon as they could to go and work in America and elsewhere, to being a Celtic tiger in a relatively liberal economy. And I suppose I wanted to start. So just tell people, you know, who you are. You've published 5 books, of which this is the latest. But how did you come to write this story about Ireland's Renaissance?
Thank you very much, James. It's lovely to be here in India discussing not just Ireland, but the lessons for all poor countries about the fact that we can actually turn back the historical clock, and with a combination of good ideas and good people and a wee bit of luck, we can actually turn things around. Also, to be here, James, the day before Republic Day in India is a real honor for me, because when we were kids in school, we were taught by priests who taught in Delhi, and my sisters were taught by nuns who taught in Delhi. We didn't realize that lots of the bourgeoisie in India suffered the same as we did at the hands of priests and nuns. So we can form a self-help group later on to discuss our trauma and all that carry on. But
those are all the people from St. Stephen's College clapping in the front.
Yes, exactly, exactly. But no, it is because we were very proud when we were in school. We were always told that the Indian Constitution, which is celebrated tomorrow, was heavily influenced by our own constitution in Ireland. Obviously, we have the similar partition of the country after independence. We've similar ethnic strife after independence. We've the mass movement of people. We've that post-colonial thing to deal with.
You all don't like the British?
We really, no, we don't mind you. You're all right. Although I must admit my heart does leap a bit at Brexit. It's kind of funny seeing you make such a mess of things after having made such a mess of us.
We'll get onto that later.
But what we know as newly independent countries is that independence is great, it's necessary, it's absolutely crucial, but the first 50 years are the hardest, and then it gets easier. So the day you turn up with the flag tends for most of us to think this is the beginning of something positive. In Ireland, it took us, James, many, many years to figure out how we were going to actually move from closed nationalism and clericalism to something much more open. So in a way, there are extraordinary parallels between the history of Ireland in the last 90 years and the history of independent India in the last 70 years. And the book was really about how economies grow, why they are suffocated for so many years, and ultimately, is there a connection, which I believe there is, between liberalism and tolerance and acceptance and offering dignity to diversity and economic and social well-being? So in a way, I suppose, Ireland sort of books the trend at the moment, James, where all or many of the rest of the world, particularly the English-speaking world, is going all nativist and atavistic and nationalistic. And we have come up with this more liberal way of going forward. And the interesting thing is, allied to that liberalism has come extraordinary wealth for a generation of Irish people. Like, I'm from the generation that was born in a country that The Economist magazine described in 1987 as the poorest of the rich. So Ireland was the poorest country in the rich world. And the book is all about how that country ended up being one of the wealthiest countries in the rich world in a very short period.
So just for there may be half of the audience appears to have been to Ireland, which is terrific.
Which I'm really impressed. The Irish Tourist Board is doing a great job.
Maybe.
Please spend a little bit more money next time you come. We need it.
Maybe the rest of the audience has seen all those Bollywood movies which are set in Dublin. But just for those few who are not familiar with Irish history, tell us a little bit about some of these landmark moments of liberalism. So you had the gay marriage referendum in 2015, and more recently the abortion referendum, both enormous seismic landmarks. But just tell us a little bit about the significance of that before we go on to the broader themes.
It's also interesting for an Indian audience that the individual who probably best represents the transformation of Ireland from a very narrow-gauge Catholic country to something different is our Prime Minister, who is half Indian. Our Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar's father, came from India as an immigrant in the 1970s. He's also a gay man. And if you had told me 20 years ago that Ireland would be run by a gay Hindu, I'd just say, no way, man, it won't happen. So Leo is really, so thank you for giving us one of your own. So during the book frames our social history from the visit of the first Pope in 1979, which I was marched along to, like everybody else in our school, to pay homage to Pope John Paul II, and the subsequent 40 year later, visit of the recent Pope, which was slightly less well attended. 1.5 million Irish people turned up in '79, and about 100,000 turned up a couple of months ago. It also bookends a period where we had an abortion referendum in '83, which was overwhelmingly rejected by the population, and we had an abortion referendum 8 months ago, which was overwhelmingly endorsed. And what really I was interested in was what happened to a society that we thought was divided, half liberal, half conservative, when ultimately it came to a small voting decision in a booth in privacy. And what we had was Naipaul's idea of all these little individual mutinies going off in people's heads that nobody talked about in public, that were incredibly private affairs, but that ultimately manifested in an overwhelming vote for tolerance, for liberalism, for live and let live, and for giving people who make mistakes in life a second chance. And this, I suppose, is the core of the book. How does the society change? And then, could that change in people's mentality be the reason that the economy took off so dramatically when it did?
I suppose your point about Ireland's Prime Minister, in a sense, is only poetic justice, given India was, by return, governed for quite a long time by an immigrant European Catholic. But let's talk about liberal values. In a sense, so I read this book, as I said, it felt strangely uplifting because, as you said in your introduction, the march of liberalism and toleration almost everywhere else in the rich world, in Britain because of Brexit, in America because of Trump, across Northern Europe where you have backlashes against immigration. These are liberal societies, but liberalism seems to be on the retreat. And there is an argument to say the same is true in India, where the secular tradition has faced challenges under the administration of Mr. Modi. So why is, I mean, is a sense Ireland just a kind of odd one out? Or are you convinced that your thesis that economic and political liberalism go together is right more generally?
Well, it always strikes me that what you see in Brexit and in the United States under Trump, and these sort of movements are, you know, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, or, you know, Le Pen in France. These are rich countries trying to find a way of sustaining economic growth at a certain level. I don't necessarily think that these are permanent. I think that the idea that, for example, you take your own country, Brexit, I mean, it's very clear to me that Brexit is a bizarre national kamikaze movement driven by a bunch of upper-class weirdos who have managed to explain to working-class people that they're on the same side. That shit wouldn't happen in Ireland, okay? We wouldn't believe that. So, and in the United States, which we know very, very well, Irish people, I was a dishwasher in the United States many, many years ago. Irish people have all, we've got cousins in America, we work there a lot, we know them. Again, I think that Trump is a bizarre aberration, and it is not the future of liberal democracies to go categorically so backward. But I do understand why it happened. And I suppose small countries like Ireland prove that you can actually do amazingly large things and big things. But the question is, why has liberalism gone backwards in certain countries and gone forward in other countries? And I believe it's because liberalism is a suite of beliefs. And it's not just what comes down from on high. It actually starts very, very low. It starts as these individual mutinies. And they happened in our country a wee bit later because we kind of screwed up for about 50 years. And I suspect, James, that what will happen in the UK is you'll have this big Comalia, this big carry-on, and Brexit, you leave the European Union, and then there'll be a moment of, wow, did we really do that? Was that us, or were we taken over by Martians? And then what you'll do is you'll actually come back in to some sort of liberal fold. And I believe that that will be the catalyst for a growth spurt in the United Kingdom, which you haven't had for quite a long time.
And what, I mean, in terms of the reaction that you've seen in Ireland, so a lot of the liberalism has been the throwing off of a clerical establishment. You talked about, you know, priests in schools, priests in a sense who were making policy, not simply controlling personal morality on what some Americans call the genital issues, but, you know, they were policymakers, and over a rapid period of time, that was stopped. So for other countries, thinking also of India, where clerical establishments have a lot of influence over some kinds of policy, I mean, how did that happen? What was the process in which the role of the Catholic Church was pushed back?
Well, I think that Indians will understand what happens in a post-colonial, post-revolutionary country, that we need a new story. We've got to tell ourselves a new story. Who are we? Who are they? How do we identify? So Irish people initially, and still first and foremost, identify ourselves as not British, right? And it's a very important part to understand, because the legacy of British rule is quite traumatic for most people, culturally, socially, economically, in terms of our dignity as a race, etc. And it takes a long, long time for that to clear and for those wounds, which are much deeper than people imagine, to actually heal. And in the interim, James, what happens is countries tell themselves a new story about themselves. So in the case of India, you had Nehru, you had self-sufficiency, you had a socialist worldview, a sort of a post-colonial worldview, non-aligned, playing both sides, etc. In Ireland, unfortunately, the void was filled by the Catholic Church, which wasn't always bad. The Catholic Church did a lot of good in education, a lot of good in the health service, but ultimately, the genital issues were a bit tricky, okay, to say the least. So if you weren't mainstream, and if you weren't playing in the center ground, and if you weren't, as my parents did and my grandparents probably decided to just go along with the flow, Ireland was an awful country to live in. I was born in that country in the late 60s. I was born in a country with no divorce, with no gay rights, with absolute control, the church over everyone's thoughts, with a constitution that bits were taken, the nice bits were taken for India, and then we put our own weird bits in, like the church being central to the society. And what happens, like any suppressive movement, is it works for a long, long time, and then the interesting thing is it just stops. And there's no moment that you can say that was the moment when a country like Ireland changed profoundly, but what you see is these gradual events. So in the 1980s, you have an abortion referendum, voted against abortion. A divorce referendum, voted against divorce. I was in New York working. I remember ringing my mum, reverse charges on a payphone. I thought we were going to win the Liberal side. Obviously, we didn't. And then you have this strange process whereby people begin to say, I've had enough of this. Travel helped enormously, James, because we're an immigrant country. So if you're an immigrant, you tend to actually see the world differently. We have a massive diaspora outside, and we all talk to each other. This is pre-WhatsApp. We still talk to each other. And what you find is that every so often you begin to see these little chinks of openness. And then you have amazing events. So we had a prime minister, a president who was voted in 1990 called Mary Robinson, a left-wing liberal prime minister. And up until then, Irish women were assumed to vote the same way as their husbands. That was what happened. To this day, my mum is 83. I don't know which way she votes, because she's from the generation that was assumed she'd vote like my dad. It transpires, she told me about a month ago, she never voted like him at all. So she used to go in and say, oh, yeah, I'll vote for your man, don't worry. And she'll put the ballot in for the female candidate. This is going back to the 50s and 60s, right? But it was assumed that women, a wee bit maybe like rural India, would vote the way the man of the house suggested. But with education and with travel and with TV and all sorts of influences, what you get is this gradual lurch to liberalism, which is the background noise of the modern economy. And I think we've got to always understand this and cherish this, that liberalism is worth fighting for.
Let me ask you another couple of questions. So you're an economist, and so some of the book is about the success of Irish business. And so although your story is about the interrelationship between liberalism and economic success, often the story that's told about Ireland is about, it's a tax haven, very good at attracting multinational corporations, that sort of thing. But without belaboring this comparison between Ireland and India, you describe a very similar situation after independence, where you had a national generation of leaders. The quote that I found was, the national revolutionary generation fetishized peasants and farmers and made an enemy of the small business person. Very similar to post-independence India. You describe this in the book, given we're at a literature festival, as a battle between Yeats, the great Irish author, and Joyce. And can you sort of explain how it was you thought that Yeats and Joyce had different attitudes towards business and how that has changed?
Well, I think this is very, very crucial, that an anti-small businessman catechism, if you will, came in Ireland from the left, who hated them, from what I call a clerisy of journalists, academics, Yeats, who was basically the narrator of Irish nationalism. So you have the high arts, journalism, academia, left-leaning publications, and of course the left, all fetishizing the Irish peasant and demonizing the small business person. And this always struck me as very years. When I was in school, we had to learn Yeats all the time, which was a complete joy. If you can imagine the most beautiful thing is going into an English literature class and having poetry, this extraordinary words being taught to you, and everyone in the class loving it. But there's a very famous poem called September 1913, which is about a lockout in Dublin. But Yeats talks about fumbling in the greasy till. And here he identifies small business people as the enemy of the state. And I could never understand, in the whole panoply of weirdos and oddities and enemies, that he could have decided that the small business person was the enemy of the state, until you realize that Yeats was an upper-class English colonialist. Sorry to put it so bluntly, my English friend, but Yeats was a member of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy who were transplanted into Ireland after Cromwell kicked 40 shades out of us. And Cromwell gave Ireland to his non-commissioned NCOs. And those non-commissioned NCOs were the Anglo-Irish aristocracy who ran the country until independence. And Yeats was one of them. And he had a very haughty landowner's attitude to commerce. In contrast, James Joyce, who is well, we all know who James Joyce is, but James Joyce is coming from a totally different tradition of the Catholic up-and-coming middle class who were suppressed by this Anglo-Irish class for many centuries. And Joyce makes, in Ulysses, Leopold Bloom his central character. And Leopold Bloom is an advertising copywriter. So imagine in the swamp of mercantile pursuits, how awful is the advertiser? Probably the worst creature in that particular swamp.
One up from the journalist.
One up from the journalist. So I was always intrigued by how Yeats decided that the small businessman was the enemy and whipped up a chorus of approval with a weird coalition from the church on one hand to the extreme atheist left on the other, of which he was the arch poet. And Joyce, who of course left Ireland, like most good people leave after a while, made an advertising everyman copywriter who walked around Dublin worried about the sewage system, as Bloom did in Ulysses, worried about whether the trams ran on time, worried about business. Joyce makes every man the hero, while Yeats invents this notion of a romantic revolutionary who only speaks Irish and lives in an island off the coast as our hero, and we know that person doesn't exist. So it was always intriguing for me, James, that the coalition against the small business person who makes the world tick in many ways was led by poets. And what Joyce realized, I think, was that the artist and the entrepreneur are actually very similar type of people. If you go back to school and remember your class, and who ended up being an artist or a writer or involved in the creative arts, and look at the other sort of people who ended up as entrepreneurs and whatever, you find that they've got very, very similar minds. Both don't want a wage, both don't want a boss, both want to express themselves, both want to create, both don't want to live within the confines of the system. They want to do things for themselves. So I think that Joyce understood this, that at the center of freedom and liberty is artistic self-expression and commercial self-expression. And that was what was liberated in Ireland in the last 30 years, that commercial self-expression to have a go.
Two more questions before we let you go on your way. So the first is a round of applause. Come on, give him a round of applause. This is book launch. There we go. So as I say, I thought the book was brilliant. You should all go and buy it. It's got a delightful pink cover. However, I was waiting for the bit where you talked about the financial crisis, because recently, Ireland, although it has a very positive image, you know, it came a cropper during the crash, right? And you do deal with that briefly at the end. But I wonder, could you say a little bit about, has that been a chastening experience, the fact that, you know, Ireland clearly rediscovered its love of capitalism, because in the 2000s, you had a crazy property boom that completely came a cropper. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we did it spectacularly. Irish people don't do things by halves, okay? When we go for it, we do things really spectacularly. Look, we all know that the easiest way, we had a massive banking crisis, but we all know that the easiest way to rob a bank is to run it. That banks get robbed from the inside out, okay? And what happened in Ireland was a bizarre, land-obsessed oligarchy, a new oligarchy financed by the banking sector, and they basically robbed the banks themselves, which is kind of bizarre. And I think one of the great leading indicators of that was when you see the chief executive of a large bank being invited to Davos to discuss global inequality, then you realize you're in trouble. And that happened to us in about 2007 when the chief executive of one of our largest banks was invited to do just that. So we made a catastrophic error that we, as a country, misdiagnosed an overdraft for real wealth. And the problem was we borrowed all the money from the Germans, and when the Germans came for their money, looking for the money back, it was all gone. And we said, oh, sorry, Gunter, we didn't realize we had to pay it all back. We didn't read the small print, but there were some of us who actually argued very strongly during this period that it was going to end up in a disastrous situation. But sometimes what happens when a country, this is why I've got some faith in you Brits, right? When you go through a terrible process, like bankruptcy or Brexit, okay, you come at the far side chastened, a little bit less arrogant, and a little bit inclined to see the world as it is. So I think you'll be fine, but it does take time.
It's as well as the fact that
we're all rooting for you, by the way. We do hope you'll be okay.
As well as the fact that Ireland has a half-Indian prime minister, it's worth pointing out that actually the richest man in Ireland is also Indian, right? Palanji Mistry, who the Mumbai-based property tycoon. Yes, so there we are. You know, India's running the place. Final question. So I have to end on Brexit, but let me ask it this way: A, if you have a thought of what's going to happen with the backstop, then tell us. But B, at the end, you say that you describe Ireland as a jockey that's been riding two horses, an EU European horse that has been very instrumental in Ireland's renaissance through structural fund investment, all of that, but also a sort of Anglo-American Atlanticist horse. You said you yourself worked in America, the Irish diaspora in America, et cetera, et cetera. Will Brexit put Ireland on a more firmly European trajectory in the future, or are you still going to be a jockey riding two horses?
Well, I think what happens in small countries is your choices are never between good and bad, but sometimes between bad and worse. Because small countries don't get to make the rules. We are rule takers in the world. And when you're a rule taker, you develop a mischievous sense of survival. And our historical links have been with the United States and the UK. But our political future is with the European Union because we have depended on the US and the UK before, and it hasn't really worked out that well. So we've decided that maybe the European Union is the place for us. And the reason is very simple, James. We had no capital 40 years ago. It's very hard to run a society when you've no money. Rich countries don't get that. And we had to make a choice, where do we get the capital from? And therefore, we made capital cheap in Ireland by making it very tax effective for Irish, particularly Irish-American chief executives American chief executives to invest in the country. And as a result of that, the country's industrial base has changed profoundly, and it has been an overwhelmingly positive experience. Brexit throws a spanner in the works because Britain has decided to leave the European Union. It's a wee bit like the moment when Jerry Halliwell decided that her solo career was so good that she should leave the Spice Girls. I think, you know, you've got the same sort of thing going on in Britain. And The backstop then is a problem with Northern Ireland because Northern Ireland is part of our island. Some believe it's part of our country, others don't. But it is governed by an agreement which allowed us to have peace in the country for a long time. And underpinning that, James, is this notion that the border wouldn't exist and we could all pretend to be whatever we wanted. So the British Protestant people could pretend to be British if they wanted, and that was fine, and the Irish Catholic people could pretend to be Irish. And I think that's a very mature settlement. What has happened is that Brexit has forced the British people to choose that they're British and not European, and consequently the Irish nationalists, which is half the population, have decided that they are being left behind. So the backstop for us is much more about culture, politics, identity, ethnicity, and all those extraordinarily difficult things than just what the upper-class Tories think is a technical issue in a border that can be solved by a few cameras.
Very good. All right. So you should all go and buy this book. Oh, it's terrific. It's the one in the bookshop that has a pink cover. Given that this is David's first book launch in India, I want you to give him a big round of applause, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.